My First Quilt Show is brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Aurifil, perfectly suited for every quilt project. Hovels, cut it close with Hovels. OmniGrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Riley Blake, colorful, playful, and sophisticated fabrics that can't help but bring a smile to your face.
Hi, I'm Sarah Gallegos and you're watching My First Quilt Show. And today we're going to talk about how to rotary cut both precisely and safely. So I've got a piece of fabric here laid out on my rotary cutting mat. And before I cut my fabrics, this happens to be a fat quarter piece, and they typically come folded up so you have a lot of crease lines in the fabric. So I press them out, and I like to use Best Press or a type of spray starch. This happens to be my favorite type because you spray it on your fabric, iron it, and all of those crease marks go away. And that is the first step to having precise cutting when it comes to rotary cutting. You want to make sure that you get rid of all those wrinkles, because if you don't, when you run your ruler along them, they kind of smooth out and it distorts the fabric a little bit. So it's good to start with nice, fresh, pressed fabric. So I folded it in half to fit the size of the rotary cutting mat, and I've lined up the folded edge along one of the horizontal lines on my rotary cutting mat, just so that I've got a nice straight edge to start with. Now, when you're working with your rotary cutter and your rotary cutting mat, you want to make sure you've got an acrylic ruler, not your typical household ruler or a yardstick or something like that. You want to make sure that you've got an acrylic ruler because it holds up to the blade and stays nice and straight for you. And when you're cutting, keeping the ruler straight is key. So it's really helpful to make sure that you've got something along the bottom of the ruler to give it a little bit of grip to the fabric, because sometimes the movement of the rotary cutter tends to make your ruler slide back and forth. So I like to use Invisigrip, and this is a paper-backed plastic, and you can cut it about 1/4 of an inch on all sides, smaller than your ruler, and you can use your ruler and your rotary cutter to cut it, and then you're going to peel the paper back off and place it right along the back side of your ruler, and it gives it just a little bit of grip so that it's not sliding around as you're cutting. Now, when you're working with an acrylic ruler and your rotary cutter, working with a bigger blade cuts faster. The rotary cutting blades come in several different sizes. You'll see really small rotary cutting blades, and those are great for working on small areas or going around curves. But if you're working with just yardage of fabric, I like to use a 45 or a 60 millimeter rotary cutting blade. And you want to make sure that it's nice and sharp. Now, handle these with care. When you change them, they are very dangerous. So you want to be sure that you're keeping care of your fingers when you're working with these. A lot of people like to use a klutz glove, and you're going to wear this glove on the hand that you're not cutting with. And that can help you to grip, and if you happen to have a slip with your rotary cutter, it protects your hand because you're not going to cut through the glove. So that's just a safety tip, especially if you are new to rotary cutting. Now, when you're cutting, you want to make sure that you're cutting away from yourself. You never want to use the rotary cutting blade toward your body. You always want to cut away from yourself. And there are a few different ways that you can cut utilizing the lines on the rotary cutting mat as well as on your ruler. So let's start by using the lines on the mat. So I'm going to place my ruler along the 1-inch marking here on my mat. And what I'm looking for is I'm just making sure that these lines on the ruler are directly on top of the lines on my mat. You can see if they're off to the side. You want to make sure that those lines line up really nicely. Get it nice and straight. And then with your non-cutting hand, place it firmly on your ruler and keep one finger off the edge of the ruler. This is going to help you to keep it nice and straight. So I've got a nice firm hold on my ruler, and then I'm going to open my rotary cutting blade and very straight away from my body, just run that blade along the edge of the ruler. And that, make sure you close your rotary cutting blade afterwards too. Now I missed one little spot there, so I'll come back up. That's an indication I might need to change my blade. And I got a really nice clean cut, and it cut the excess off. So I now have one more straight edge on my fabric. If I wanted to really square this fabric up and get rid of my selvages, now I would need to cut along the long edge. But again, you always want to make sure that you're cutting away from your body. Sometimes you have the temptation to cut this direction, but it really isn't the right way to do it. You can slip, cut yourself, or cut into your fabric in a way that you don't want to. So once again, I'm just going to line my ruler up, and I'm using now the lines on the mat as well as that straight edge on the fabric. So this time I've actually got the straight edge one of the line markings on the ruler along that cut edge of my fabric so I can be sure that I'm nice and straight, because it's hard to see the numbers at the back edge of the rotary cutting mat. So this gives me 2 different places to verify that I'm staying straight. And once again, we'll cut right along that edge. And we get another nice clean cut. We'll turn that mat again. That's one of the nice things about a smaller mat, is that you do have the ability to turn that mat around and cut as you need to. So I'll line up my lines once again, nice and straight. So measure twice, cut once. Take your time and make sure you line everything up so you get perfect cuts. We'll cut once more. And now I've cut my fabric nice and straight. I feel really good about that. So let's say, for example, I wanted to subcut this large piece of fabric. I've got clean ends on each side. I've cut off my selvage. And let's say, for example, I wanted a 3-inch strip. Now this time I'm going to use the lines on the ruler instead of the lines on my rotary cutting mat. So I'm just going to slide the ruler along my fabric until I've got my fabric in a corner on the ruler. So 1, 2, 3 inches are filled with fabric. And when I line this up, I like to make sure that in between the dash marks on my ruler, I can see that the fabric is nice and straight along that 3-inch marking. I'm also straight up here. So once again, I'm going to apply really good pressure and cut straight away from myself. I think I need to do one more. Here we go. And I now have a nice 3-inch strip. So anytime that you need to work on cutting pieces, that's a really easy way to do it. So let's say we wanted to now subcut that 3-inch strip into 3-inch squares. We can get this out of the way. And now I would actually switch to a smaller ruler. I don't need the length of that ruler to be able to cut 3-inch squares. And the smaller ruler you use, the more precision you can get. So we'll take a little smaller ruler, and I'm just going to line up the straight edge of my fabric on the 3-inch marking on my small ruler, and I'm verifying that these edges are nice and straight as well. Firm pressure and cuts. And now we have 3-inch squares. So now you're ready to start piecing a quilt. You've got squares started. Sometimes though, you've got to cut some interesting measurements. It's not always an even number, a 3-inch or a 3.5-inch piece that you need to cut. Sometimes you'll find that you need to cut maybe a 3 7/8 square. And it can be kind of challenging on your ruler to see where those 7/8 markings are. They're all on the ruler, nice straight lines, but it can be a little bit challenging to make sure you're staying straight with every single cut, especially with all those little tiny black markings like on this ruler. And that's where I like to use a little bit of a ruler tape. This is glow line tape. And if I wanted to cut 3 7/8, I can flip my ruler over and place the tape right along that 7/8 marking on the back side of my ruler. We'll cut off the excess. And now when I place the ruler on my fabric, I'm lining up the back cut edge of my fabric with the pink tape. And then cutting. And so I now have a 3-inch by 3 7/8 rectangle. So that tape can be really, really handy for seeing those funny measurements. So we'll get rid of that. And let's talk about triangles. Sometimes you need to cut triangle pieces too. And there are rulers of every shape and size. So we'll just bring our fabric back over here. And what's nice about the triangle rulers that you can get is they typically have inch markings going down the height of the ruler. So you can see if you need to cut a 3-inch triangle or a 5-inch triangle. And what I like to do is line up my ruler. Say we're going to do a 6-inch. Nice and straight along the 6-inch marking. And we'll give it a cut. And again, cutting away from our body. And now I've got to cut this edge here. And instead of cutting this way, I'm going to rotate my mat around so that I can get to that next edge. Pull the fabric away, and I see that I need to change my blade. I'm going to cut that edge again. There we go. And now we have a nice triangle cut. So using a triangle ruler for cutting triangles is a lot easier than starting with squares and trying to get all the different dimensions of a triangle, because you've got lots of different degrees of triangles. So get yourself a nice sharp rotary blade and some scrap fabric and practice cutting. That's the best way to get good at cutting. Just practice, make sure you're staying safe, watching your fingers, maybe even using a glove. And come back and see me next time on My First Quilt Show, where we're gonna actually start sewing. We're gonna talk about tips and tricks for your sewing machine.
My First Quilt Show is brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Aurifil, perfectly suited for every quilt project. Hovels, cut it close with Hovels. OmniGrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Riley Blake, colorful, playful, and sophisticated fabrics that can't help but bring a smile to your face.